Sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought in distant lands or corporate boardrooms. Sometimes they happen right in your backyard, where the soil beneath your feet becomes the front line of a war you never saw coming. This is the story of how I discovered that peace can be the most dangerous thing you'll ever find. After decades of answering to bosses, punching time clocks, and living by other people's schedules, I finally did what every working person dreams of doing. I bought my freedom. 120 acres of rolling hills, thick oak trees, an open sky that stretched as far as my tired eyes could see. This wasn't just land, this was liberation in its purest form. The morning I first walked my property line, the silence hit me like a revelation. No car horns, no office chatter, no phones ringing with someone else's emergency. Just the gentle bleating of my goats in the distance, the soft padding of my dog's paws on the dirt path, and the whisper of wind through leaves that had been growing here long before I was born. For the first time in my adult life, I could breathe without checking a clock. I'd earned every inch of this sanctuary through sweat, sacrifice, and years of saving every penny I could spare. The old barn that came with the property became my cathedral, weathered wood and honest craftsmanship that had withstood decades of storms. My goats, Bella and Winston, had claimed the back pasture as their kingdom, while my dogs, Max and Luna, appointed themselves as the unofficial security detail for our little slice of paradise. Those first few months were everything I'd dreamed. They would be. I woke with the sun, not because an alarm demanded it, but because my body finally remembered its natural rhythm. I spent my days mending fences, not metaphorical ones in office politics, but real ones that kept my animals safe and happy. Evenings were for sitting on my porch with a cup of coffee that had grown cold while I watched the sunset paint my land in shades of gold and amber. Peace, I learned, was not the absence of sound, but the presence of purpose. Every morning brought simple, honest work. Every evening brought the satisfaction of a day well lived on land that was truly mine. I thought I'd found my ending, the quiet conclusion to a life of noise and chaos. But peace, as I would soon discover, can make you a target for those who profit from chaos. It started with something so small, so seemingly insignificant, that I almost dismissed it entirely. A sign zipped out to my front fence like it had always belonged there. White plastic with bold black letters that seemed to shout their importance. Property under review. Compliance required. No signature, no contact information, no explanation of what exactly needed to comply with what. I stood there for a full minute, coffee mug steaming in the morning air, reading and rereading those words as if they might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. This was farmland, not a housing development. This was the middle of nowhere, not the suburbs. Who exactly was reviewing my property? And what compliance could they possibly require from land that had been working farmland for over a century? My first instinct was right. It had to be a prank. Probably some teenagers with too much time and too little supervision. I yanked the sign down, carried it to my burn pile, and watched the plastic melt into black smoke that disappeared into the vast sky above my land. I went back to my morning routine, feeding the goats and checking the fence line, convinced I'd solved a problem that wasn't really a problem at all. That was my first mistake. I'd underestimated how far some people will go when they believe a clipboard gives them the right to control other people's lives. The next morning brought visitors, and not the kind you invite for coffee and conversation. I was in the barn, mucking out stalls and listening to the contented sounds of my animals, when I heard the unmistakable crunch of tires on my gravel drive. Through the barn door, I watched a pristine white SUV roll to a stop near my front porch. It was the kind of vehicle that screamed suburban soccer mom. But something about the way it parked, precisely, deliberately, like it was claiming territory, set my teeth on edge. Out stepped a woman who looked like she'd stepped from the pages of a country club magazine. Pastel pink blazer, perfectly pressed khakis, and shoes that had clearly never touched actual dirt. But it was what she carried that made my blood run cold. A clipboard, held against her chest like a shield, with papers neatly organized and a pen attached by a small chain. In my experience, nothing good ever came from people who treated clipboards like weapons of war. She approached my porch with the confident stride of someone who'd never been told no, her heels clicking against my wooden steps like a countdown timer. When I emerged from the barn, she flashed a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "Good morning," she chirped, extending a manicured hand that had clearly never done a day of manual labor. "I'm Meredith Lane, president of the Valley Ridge Homeowners Association. I believe we need to talk." I blinked, certain I'd misheard. "HOA," I repeated, wiping my hands on my work jeans. "Ma'am, this is farmland. Has been for generations. There's no HOA out here." Her smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind her eyes. "Oh, but there is now," she said, producing a thick manila folder from beneath her clipboard. "The Valley Ridge HOA was established 6 months ago to maintain property values and community standards in this developing area." She handed me the folder with the ceremonial gravity of someone delivering a royal decree. Inside, I found page After page of regulations, bylaws, and rules that read like they'd been written by someone who'd never set foot on actual farmland. Livestock restrictions, building codes, fence specifications, and maintenance schedules that would have been absurd in downtown suburbia, let alone on working agricultural land. According to our preliminary assessment, Meredith continued, consulting her clipboard like it contained the secrets of the universe. Your property has several compliance issues that need immediate attention. Your barn structure doesn't meet our architectural guidelines. Your fencing is non-standard, and your livestock. She paused, wrinkling her nose as Bella, the goat, bleated in the distance. Falls outside our approved animal parameters. I flipped through the pages, each more ridiculous than the last. Someone had taken satellite photos of my property and marked them up like a military target assessment. Red circles around my barn, arrows pointing to fence posts, and detailed annotations about structural non-compliance and aesthetic violations. The barn that had weathered decades of storms was apparently visually inconsistent with community standards. The fence that kept my animals safe was improperly maintained and inadequately uniform. This is ridiculous, I said, handing the folder back. I don't know what game you're playing, but I'm not interested. This is private property, and I'll manage it as I see fit. Meredith's smile finally cracked, revealing something sharper underneath. I'm afraid it's not that simple, she said, her voice losing its practiced cheerfulness. Property ownership comes with community responsibilities. We'll be in touch regarding your compliance timeline. She turned and walked back to her SUV with the same mechanical precision she'd used to approach, leaving me standing on my own porch feeling like I'd just been invaded by the world's most polite army. As she drove away, gravel crunching under her pristine tires, I noticed she took several photos through her passenger window, documenting my property like evidence in a case I didn't know I was part of. That night, I called my neighbor Bill, whose family had farmed the adjacent land for 3 generations. Bill, I said, you ever hear of a Valley Ridge HOA? His laughter came through the phone like a bark. Boy, you been drinking? Ain't no HOA out here. Never has been, never will be. This is farming country, not some gated community fantasy. But the evidence was there, documented and laminated, and officially notarized. Either someone had created an elaborate hoax, or something far more disturbing was happening on my land. I spent the evening researching, diving deep into property records and county filings, looking for any trace of this supposed homeowners association. What I found chilled me to the bone. The Valley Ridge HOA had indeed been registered 6 months ago, just as Meredith had claimed. But the registration was based on a property survey that included not just my land, but a dozen other properties in a 20-mile radius. Farms, ranches, and rural homes that had been independent for generations were suddenly, legally, under the jurisdiction of an organization that none of the property owners had ever heard of. 2 days later, the harassment escalated. I woke to find more signs, bigger ones this time, laminated and weather-resistant, nailed directly into the side of my barn like they were claiming it as their own territory. Non-compliance notice, livestock violation, and structural review. In progress, blazed in official-looking fonts that were clearly designed to intimidate. But signs were just the beginning. That afternoon, I spotted them from my kitchen window. 2 men in matching khaki uniforms, complete with radio equipment and official-looking badges, walking my property line like they were conducting a military reconnaissance mission. They moved with purpose, stopping to take photos, measurements, and notes on clipboards that seemed to multiply like rabbits. I grabbed my jacket and headed outside to confront them. Up close, they looked like security guards playing dress-up, complete with vests labeled HOA enforcement, in bold letters that were probably ordered from the same website that sold fake police badges to mall cops. Gentlemen, I called out, my voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from years of dealing with people who mistake uniforms for actual power. You're on private property without permission. Time to leave. The taller one, a man with thinning hair and the soft build of someone who'd spent more time behind a desk than in the field, consulted his clipboard before responding. Sir, we're conducting a routine compliance assessment under the authority of the Valley Ridge HOA Charter. Section 4.2b. I almost laughed. Almost charter. Son, the only authority out here is the deed in my filing cabinet and the sheriff's department. Neither one of them sent you. The second man, younger but with the same clipboard, wielding confidence, stepped forward. Sir, according to our records, this property falls under HOA jurisdiction as of 6 months ago. We're simply documenting current conditions for the compliance review process. And I'm simply telling you to get off my land before I call the real authorities. I replied, pulling out my phone to emphasize the point. They exchanged glances, the kind of look that said they'd encountered resistance before and had a protocol for dealing with it. The tall one made a note on his clipboard, probably marking me down as uncooperative or hostile to authority. Then they walked away, but not before the younger one dropped his clipboard near my fence post. Curiosity got the better of me. I waited until their vehicle disappeared down the road before examining what he'd left behind. Inside the clipboard was a treasure trove of information that made my skin crawl. Maps of my property with detailed photos taken from multiple angles, including some that could only have been shot from the road with a telephoto lens. And most disturbing of all, a routing sheet with my property marked as Alpha, high resistance. Alpha high resistance. Like I was some kind of military objective instead of a man trying to live peacefully on his own land. That evening, I called Sheriff Langston, a man I'd known casually from town council meetings and church socials. He had the kind of steady voice that came from 20 years of dealing with every kind of trouble a rural county could produce. "Langston," I said, "I need to ask you about something strange. You ever hear of a Valley Ridge HOA operating out here?" There was a pause, the kind that stretches long enough to carry weight. "Can't say I have," he finally replied, "but I'll tell you what I do know. That Meredith Lane woman has been causing trouble for years. Tried to shut down Henderson's feed store last spring, claiming they were violating some kind of rural noise ordinance she'd invented. Filed complaints about the county fair being too loud, too messy, too country for her taste. So you know her? Know her? Hell, I've arrested her twice for filing false police reports. Woman's got a grudge against anything that doesn't fit her picture of how the world should look. You having trouble with her?" I told him about the signs, the fake enforcement officers, and the clipboard full of surveillance materials. Langston listened without interrupting. "The way cops do when they're processing information that doesn't fit any normal pattern. Son," he said finally, "that don't sound like any HOA I ever heard of. Sounds like harassment with extra steps. You want my advice? Document everything, keep records, and if they set foot on your property again without permission, you call me immediately." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that routing sheet, about being labeled as high resistance, like I was some kind of insurgent instead of a man who just wanted to be left alone on his own land. Somewhere out there, in an office or meeting room I'd never seen, people were discussing me like I was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected. I decided to prepare. Not for war, I wasn't looking for a fight, but for the possibility that this situation was far from over. I installed motion sensors along my property line, the kind hunters use to monitor game trails. Trail cameras went up at strategic points, hidden among the trees but with clear sightlines to my barn, my house, and the main access road. Floodlights with motion triggers were positioned to turn night into day at the first sign of unwanted visitors. I wasn't building a fortress. I was simply ensuring that if someone wanted to continue treating my property like their personal playground, they'd do it in full view of my security system. Every rural landowner knows that the best defense against trouble is making sure trouble knows it's being watched. The night of the raid, I learned just how right I'd been to prepare. It was just past 3 in the morning when the first motion sensor triggered, then another, then 3 more in rapid succession, creating a cascade of alerts that lit up my phone like a Christmas tree. I rolled out of bed, grabbed my coffee pot out of habit, and checked the security monitors I'd installed in my kitchen. What I saw through the green glow of night vision cameras made my blood run cold. 5 figures moved across my backfield like ghosts, their movements coordinated and purposeful. They wore dark clothing and moved in formation, each equipped with headlamps, radio equipment, and the kind of tactical gear that you don't buy at the local sporting goods store. These weren't teenagers pulling pranks or lost hikers looking for directions. This was a coordinated operation, complete with what appeared to be designated roles and predetermined routes. Through my headphones, I could hear fragments of radio chatter, call signs, position reports, and references to something called Phase 1 compliance. The leader, a figure slightly taller than the others, carried the now familiar clipboard, but this time it was enclosed in a waterproof case and attached to his vest with military-grade carabiner. Another member of the team carried what looked suspiciously like a taser, its distinctive shape unmistakable even through the grainy night vision footage. They moved with the confidence of people who believed they had every right to be there, despite the obvious fact that they were trespassing on private property in the middle of the night. Their whispered conversations, picked up by my audio equipment, revealed planning and preparation that went far beyond amateur harassment. Team Alpha, approaching Structure Charlie, came through my speakers in a voice that was trying too hard to sound official, confirming Phase 1 parameters. Livestock verification in progress. Team Alpha, Phase 1. These people had given themselves military designations for what amounted to late-night trespassing on a goat farm. The absurdity would have been laughable if it hadn't been so deeply disturbing. I made my coffee. If you're going to confront people who think your land is their mission objective, you might as well be properly caffeinated, and stepped onto my front porch. The motion-triggered floodlights hadn't activated yet, so I was invisible in the darkness, watching these self-appointed commandos creep around my property like they were planning to plant a flag and claim it for their imaginary republic. "Y'all, planning to announce yourselves?" I called out into the darkness, my voice carrying across the still night air. or just hoping for the element of surprise. The effect was immediate and deeply satisfying. 5 figures froze like deer in headlights, their coordinated movement dissolving into amateur panic. Radio chatter exploded into frantic whispers and muffled curses as they tried to figure out how their covert operation had been blown before it even began. The team leader, clipboard clutched to his chest like a shield, stepped forward and attempted to salvage the situation with an impressive display of bureaucratic double. Sir, we're conducting an emergency compliance assessment under the authority of Rural Safety Code 47B, which grants us inspection rights during designated emergency periods. Rural Safety Code 47B. I repeated, taking a sip of my coffee and letting the silence stretch long enough to highlight just how ridiculous that sounded. Did y'all print that in a coloring book, or did someone actually spend time making up numbers that sound official? The second team member, apparently the designated backup authority figure, produced a laminated card that he held up like it was a badge. Sir, this is a legitimate emergency assessment. We have documentation authorizing this inspection under emergency provisions. Emergency provisions for what exactly? Are my goats planning a revolt? Is my barn about to achieve sentience and file for statehood? That's when Linda, the goat, my 4-legged early warning system, decided to join the conversation. Linda had never met a stranger she didn't want to headbutt, and these midnight visitors were about to learn why I kept her in the front pasture. She came charging out of the darkness like a furry missile, head down and horns forward, aimed directly at the amateur commando who'd been waving the laminated card around. The collision was spectacular. One moment he was standing there trying to look official with his fake documentation, the next he was flat on his back in the mud, covered in the kind of farm dirt that doesn't wash out easily, while Linda stood over him making the satisfied bleating sound she reserved for successful defensive operations. Chaos erupted immediately. My floodlights triggered, turning the night into blazing day and revealing the full absurdity of the situation. 5 grown adults in tactical cosplay gear, scattered across my property like action figures thrown by an angry child. The security alarms I'd installed began their electronic screaming, adding a soundtrack of urban urgency to what had become a thoroughly rural comedy. Radio chatter exploded into panicked coordination attempts as the team tried to regroup, while Linda continued her aggressive patrol of her territory. Max and Luna, my loyal dogs, emerged from the barn to investigate the commotion, adding their barking to the symphony of chaos that had replaced the peaceful silence of my sanctuary. And then, like divine intervention, set to the rhythm of gravel under tires, I heard the most beautiful sound in the world, the rumble of Sheriff Langston's patrol car coming up my drive, red and blue lights painting my property in patriotic colors. Langston rolled down his window and surveyed the scene with the weary expression of a man who'd seen every kind of human foolishness in his 20-year career. 5 adults in costume gear, one covered in mud and goat hair, surrounded by honking alarms and defensive livestock, all trying to explain why they had every right to be conducting military exercises on someone else's farm at 3 in the morning. Gentlemen, Langston said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that doesn't require volume. I'm going to need to see some identification and hear a very compelling explanation for why you're trespassing on private property in tactical gear. The arrest process was swift and professional. 3 of the 5 Team Alpha members found themselves in handcuffs, charged with criminal trespassing, harassment, and impersonating government officials. The other 2, including the team leader with his precious clipboard, managed to disappear into the darkness before Langston could corral them. But Meredith Lane wasn't finished. If anything, the failed midnight raid seemed to energize her like a general whose first battle plan had been defeated, but whose war was far from over. 2 weeks later, I was served with legal papers that made the midnight raid look like amateur hour. Meredith was suing me for hostile disruption of legitimate community action, interference with lawful property assessment, and creating a public safety hazard through aggressive animal management. The lawsuit was professionally prepared, filed through a legitimate law firm, and backed by the kind of money that doesn't come from small-town HOA dues. Someone was funding this operation, and they had deep enough pockets to hire real lawyers, who specialized in property disputes and civil enforcement actions. Inside the legal packet, nestled between motions and citations, I found something that made my heart sink. A list of names. Local residents who had allegedly provided statements, supporting the HOA's actions. Neighbors I'd known for years. People I'd helped during harvest season and shared coffee with at the local diner. And there, third name from the top, was someone I'd considered a friend. Next to his name, in small but clear type, was a single word that hit me like a physical blow. Informant. The betrayal cut deeper than the legal threats or the midnight raids. This wasn't just about property rights or bureaucratic overreach anymore. This was about trust, community, and the discovery that people you'd shared meals with were willing to sell you out to strangers with clipboards and fancy legal letterhead. The propaganda campaign began the next day. Flyers appeared throughout town like mushrooms after rain, posted on bulletin boards, tucked under windshield wipers, and handed out at the local coffee shop. My property was labeled Zone B, high risk, complete with bullet points that read like a terrorist watch list. Unauthorized, livestock creating public health concerns, verbal hostility toward community representatives, refusal to participate in legitimate community improvement processes, the pattern of aggressive resistance to reasonable requests. Each accusation was carefully worded to sound official, while remaining vague enough to avoid outright lies. But the effect was clear. I was being painted as a dangerous recluse, whose presence threatened the safety and property values of everyone around me. The social isolation was swift and devastating. Neighbors who'd waved from their tractors for months suddenly found reasons to look the other way when I drove past. Prices at the local feed store mysteriously increased when I tried to buy supplies for my animals. The mechanic who'd serviced my truck for years suddenly had a 3-week waiting list whenever I called for an appointment. Online, the campaign intensified. Someone had created a Facebook group called Valley Ridge Community Safety, where residents shared their concerns about problematic properties and resistance to community improvement. Photos of my barn appeared alongside discussions about rural decay and the importance of maintaining standards. One post, shared dozens of times, read, "We moved here for the peaceful rural lifestyle." But some residents seem to think that means they can ignore basic community responsibilities. If you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. The passive-aggressive suburbanization of rural life had found its digital voice, and I was its primary target. Meredith organized rallies with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before. No permits, no official authorization, just a folding table, a battery-powered microphone, and poster boards that looked like they'd been created by a disturbed art student. Emergency community safety briefing. The signs announced, complete, with my address and property description, concerned residents, welcome, refreshments provided. I watched from my porch as cars filled the field across from my property, families emerging with the determined expressions of people who'd been convinced they were fighting for truth and justice. Meredith stood before them like a general addressing troops, pointing dramatically toward my house as she spoke. This resident has repeatedly refused dialogue, her amplified voice carried across the evening air. He believes he's above community standards, untouchable by reasonable requests for cooperation. She handed out flyers like communion wafers, each one containing carefully edited photos of my property, alongside inflammatory text that made my goats sound like an environmental disaster and my barn look like a condemned structure threatening property values throughout the county. "We call it negligence," she announced to the assembled crowd. "We call it disorder. But most importantly, we call it unacceptable." The crowd murmured their agreement, some holding up cell phones to record her presentation for social media distribution. I was watching my reputation being assassinated in real time, orchestrated by a woman who'd turned harassment into a community event complete with refreshments and audience participation. The next morning brought a new level of escalation, a laminated notice zip-tied to my mailbox with the official weight of a government document. Final notice, Tier 3, non-compliance status. It proclaimed in fonts that were clearly designed to look governmental. The demands were specific and non-negotiable. Remove all livestock from the property within 72 hours. Paint all structures in community approved neutral colors. Gray was suggested. Attend a mandatory rural community integration seminar to be held in Meredith's garage the following Tuesday. One of the suggested seminar topics made me question whether I was living in reality or had somehow fallen into a dystopian novel. Silent Fences, How Your Property Speaks for You and What It's Saying About Community Values. I read the notice 3 times, each reading making it more surreal. Someone had spent time creating official-looking documents that demanded I paint my century-old barn gray and attend re-education classes in a suburban garage. The level of delusion required to believe this was legitimate authority was staggering. But the harassment was about to take a darker turn. Over the next week, my trail cameras began going offline, one by one. Not broken, not malfunctioning, deliberately disabled. Wires cut with precision, cameras repositioned to face away from my property, memory cards removed. Someone was systematically blinding my security system with a kind of technical knowledge that suggested this wasn't amateur hour anymore. A white sedan began appearing at random times, parked on the public road just within view of my house. Always idling, always occupied, always gone before I could approach to investigate. The license plate traced back to a nonprofit organization called Community Horizon Outreach, an organization whose director, according to public records, was one Meredith Lane. She hadn't just escalated her harassment campaign, she'd incorporated it, complete with 501c3 status and the kind of legal protection that comes with nonprofit designation. The HOA had been just the beginning. Now she was running surveillance operations under the cover of community outreach work. But the attack on Max, my loyal German Shepherd, crossed a line that transformed this from harassment into something far more sinister. I found him limping near the fence line, whimpering in a way that cut straight to my heart. His front paw was cut, not accidentally, but deliberately. Glass had been embedded in the soft pad between his toes with the precision of someone who knew exactly how to cause maximum pain without permanent damage. The glass fragments weren't random debris. They were placed strategically, angled upward in the dirt where Max routinely patrolled, positioned to cause injury to any dog following his normal protective patterns. This wasn't vandalism or coincidence. This was calculated cruelty designed to send a message: comply, or the people you love get hurt. Sheriff Langston examined the scene with the grim professionalism of someone who'd investigated real crimes committed by people with genuine evil in their hearts. This wasn't an accident, he confirmed, photographing the glass fragments and their deliberate placement. Someone wanted to hurt your dog specifically. This is a threat, pure and simple. That's when I decided to go public. I uploaded everything to YouTube, TikTok, and Facebook simultaneously. Security footage of the midnight raid, recordings of the fake enforcement officers, photos of the propaganda flyers, and documentation of the systematic harassment campaign that had turned my peaceful farm into a battlefield. The video was titled, "When Your HOA Thinks They're the FBI," and within the first hour, it had hundreds of views. By the end of the day, those hundreds had become thousands. By the end of the week, millions of people around the world were watching a suburban wannabe dictator and her army of clipboard warriors get exposed for the fraudulent bullies they really were. Comments poured in from people sharing their own HOA horror stories, rural landowners facing similar harassment, and legal experts offering advice and support. The video became a rallying cry for property rights advocates and a cautionary tale about what happens when petty authority goes unchecked. But more importantly, other victims began speaking up. Farmers 3 counties overshared footage of similar harassment campaigns. Ranch owners in different states reported identical tactics: fake authority figures, psychological pressure campaigns, and systematic isolation of property owners who refused to comply with invented regulations. Meredith's operation wasn't unique. It was part of a pattern, a methodology being replicated across rural America by people who'd turned harassment into a profitable enterprise. The public exposure had its intended effect. Meredith's team crumbled under scrutiny like vampires exposed to sunlight. The fake enforcement officers disappeared. The propaganda flyers stopped appearing. The surveillance sedan vanished from my road. But Meredith herself wasn't finished. If anything, the public humiliation seemed to transform her from an amateur bully into something far more dangerous, a true believer with nothing left to lose. She appeared at my door one final time, but this version of Meredith was stripped of pretense and suburban politeness. No pastel blazer, no practiced smile, no clipboard held like a talisman. Just a middle-aged woman in a wrinkled shirt carrying a manila folder that looked like it contained state secrets. "You think this ends with me?" she asked, her voice flat and emotionless in a way that was far more threatening than any shouting could have been. "You think exposing a few local volunteers solves your problem?" She handed me the folder with hands that shook slightly, not from fear, but from the kind of barely controlled rage that comes from having your life's work destroyed by someone you'd underestimated. Inside the folder were documents that changed everything I thought I knew about this situation. Government seals, agency, letterheads, and classification codes that looked legitimate because they were legitimate. This wasn't suburban woman cosplaying as federal authority. This was suburban woman working as a federal contractor. The centerpiece document was labeled Rural Behavioral Management Initiative, Phase 2 Implementation Guidelines. It was signed, dated, and stamped with the kind of official seals that don't get faked easily. References to target demographics, resistance patterns, and community compliance metrics filled pages of analysis that read like counterinsurgency strategy applied to property rights disputes. My hands shook as I read my own psychological profile, compiled by people who'd never met me but knew everything about my daily routines, my habits, my triggers, and my weaknesses. Subject demonstrates classic autonomous personality markers. One section noted high resistance to external authority, strong territorial instincts, likely to escalate rather than comply under pressure. They'd been studying me like a lab rat, documenting my behavior patterns and predicting my responses with the kind of precision that comes from extensive surveillance and professional analysis. Every interaction, every confrontation, every defensive measure I'd taken had been anticipated and cataloged by people who turned human psychology into a weapon of control. Sheriff Langston's voice was tight with controlled anger when I called him with this new evidence. "Son, you need to bring that folder to the county attorney's office first thing tomorrow morning. This isn't local harassment anymore. This is federal overreach with a paper trail." The county attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Chin Hood, spent 15 years prosecuting everything from cattle theft to corporate fraud, examined the documents with the focused intensity of someone who recognized the significance of what she was seeing. "These are real federal documents," she confirmed after 2 hours of verification calls and database searches. The Rural Behavioral Management Initiative is a legitimate federal program, but it's supposed to be focused on preventing domestic terrorism in rural areas, not harassing law-abiding property owners. She paused, looking up from the documents with an expression that mixed professional concern with personal outrage. Someone has taken a legitimate counter-terrorism program and perverted it into a tool for property acquisition and social control. This is criminally corrupt on multiple levels. Armed with legitimate federal authorization, we obtained search warrants for Meredith's property and the Community Horizon Outreach Office. What we found there transformed a local harassment case into something that would eventually involve federal investigators and congressional oversight committees. Meredith's house looked normal from the outside. Suburban, well-maintained, the kind of place where someone might run a small business or manage a nonprofit organization. But behind a false wall in her basement, we discovered what could only be described as a command center for psychological warfare. Binders filled with detailed profiles of rural property owners across 3 states. Maps marked with pins indicating compliance status and intervention priority. Surveillance photographs taken with telephoto lenses from public roads, cataloging the daily routines of people who had no idea they were being watched and documented. My file was 6 inches thick. Photos of me feeding my animals, detailed schedules of my daily routines, psychological assessments based on my responses to various provocations, and strategic recommendations for escalating pressure until compliance is achieved or relocation becomes preferable. Other residents were labeled with clinical precision: compliant, no further action required; exit achieved, property acquired, pending disruption, phase 2 authorization requested. Human beings reduced to data points in a spreadsheet designed to catalog the destruction of rural independence. A wall-mounted map showed the scope of the operation: 3 counties, 47 properties, each marked with pins indicating their status in what was clearly a systematic campaign of rural gentrification through intimidation. Properties marked P1, probation, were under initial surveillance. P2, persuasion, indicated active harassment campaigns. P3, relocation, marked properties where the campaign had succeeded in driving out the original owners. Sheriff Langston stood in that basement command center and said what we were all thinking: this isn't HOA harassment. This is psychological warfare with a federal budget and professional coordination. The arrests came swiftly. Charges included wire fraud, conspiracy, impersonating federal officials, harassment, stalking, and violation of civil rights under color of authority. Meredith's lawyer called it an ambitious grassroots community improvement initiative that may have exceeded proper boundaries. Langston called it a cult with a mailing list and government funding. But the investigation was far from over, as neighbors began coming forward with their own stories of harassment and intimidation. A pattern emerged that was far more disturbing than any of us had initially realized. She told us if we didn't cooperate, we'd be targeted next, admitted Tom Morrison, whose farm bordered mine to the south. Said the federal program was expanding, and anyone who didn't support community improvement would be classified as a potential domestic threat. Sarah Chen, who owned the Organic Asterisk,